Добрый день, уважаемые друзья, уважаемые коллеги. Сегодня у нас очередная лекция, если кто знает, а поскольку вы здесь, то вы знаете, из серии не очень скромные выдающиеся лекторы мира. Но сегодня у нас в гостях действительно выдающийся человек, очень авторитетный в своей области, очень известный в мире. Это вице-президент компании BP и председатель экспертной группы по классификации ресурсов Организации Объединенных Наций Дэвид МакДональд. Давайте поприветствуем. Я без лишних слов передам слово Дэвиду. И прошу вас, значит, во-первых, есть переводы, и после того, как господин МакДональд закончит лекцию, у нас будет достаточное количество времени для того, чтобы задать вопросы. И я вас прошу не стесняться, спрашивать по всем тем направлениям, о которых будет идти речь. Я надеюсь, что будет крайне интересно и познавательно, и, главное, полезно. Спасибо большое. Дэвид.
Well, thank you very much for attending this beautiful Saturday morning. I'm not sure when I was a student, this was something I would choose to do on a Saturday morning, so I very much appreciate the respect and interest you're showing in the subject matter to give up your day of your weekend to come in. Perhaps to start, to introduce myself, in addition to what Mr. Shburov has just said, I am in charge of BP's reserves classification, estimation, and reporting. And a big part of that is what BP is doing here in Russia. And I thought maybe I'd just take a couple of moments to describe BP's work here within Russia. We're not new in Russia. We've been here since 1990, when we first entered the market, so longer than many of you have been around, actually. So we've been here for a very long time. We've participated both on the retail side. So on driving in from the airport, I noticed there were some BP petrol stations. So we're definitely on the retail side within the market here. We also have a very large position within the oil and gas producing. Our aim here in Russia is to be recognized by external observers, which includes all of you, as the most successful international energy company operating in Russia. And we're hopefully well along the way to achieving that. We have our holdings are in a number of different ways within Russia. I think you can kind of think of three main strands. Our first is we have a very strategic investment in Rosneft. We have a shareholding in the company of just under 20%. And we've had $2.7 billion of dividends paid out from the company and that investment since 2013. And we have about 1.1 million barrels of oil equivalent a day from that. And about 40% of BP's, so the title BP Group's reserves, proved oil and gas reserves, are contained in Russia as a result of this investment. But it's not the only thing we're doing in Russia. We also are building a complementary business that invests within joint ventures across the group. And as you can see there, we're very active in 4 different joint ventures, all with Rosneft: the Taz joint venture, Yermak, Karampur, and then outside of Russia, but still with Rosneft, in the Zohr major gas field in Egypt. And the third strand that we have working in Russia is to help build broad cooperation with the industry and people to work on building a healthy and safe environment for the work we do, working on framework agreements across the industry, and building capabilities and processes across upstream and downstream. So hopefully we're going to have a long and healthy relationship within BP. And we have a large office in Moscow, and we do have some graduates from St. Petersburg University working in that office, and I hope maybe someday to see some of you there as I come to visit our offices there in the future. But to get started for today, the topic of my discussion is about transforming natural resource management for a sustainable planet. And I'm giving this talk not under the auspices of my work that I do with BP, but of the other role I have, which is with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, where I chair the expert group on resource management. If you think about it, 70 years ago, really out of the ashes of the war and division that we had with World War II, the people of the world, many of your grandparents and great-grandparents, came together to form the United Nations. And the supreme embodiment of that is the Charter of the United Nations, which really describes the values of peace and the dialogue of international cooperation that underpin our modern society. In 2015, the 193 member states of the United Nations took an equally bold decision, one of real historic significance, with the adoption of an agenda for 2030. And with that came along 17 sustainable development goals and a number of measurable targets that they aim to complete to really transform the world in which we all live. While governments are going to have the primary responsibility for prioritizing, implementing the activities to reach these goals, private industry, academia, and non-government organizations are going to play a crucial part in delivering these goals. And I'd go further to say that everyone in this room is really responsible for helping us to deliver on these sustainable development goals. But if we talk about what sustainable development is our goal, I think it's really important that we make sure that we understand what we're talking about and have a consistent definition about that. So this is the definition that was adopted by the World Commission on Environment and Development, and it's that sustainable development is that which meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I really like this definition because I think it very powerfully balances the needs of today with those of the future. We want to have sustainable development. We want to have the ability for people in the future to meet their needs with resources that we have today. But we also recognize that we have to be able to meet the needs of today. If we don't solve and supply for people today, we're never going to be able to meet the needs of the future. This is really a very bold goal to be able to achieve this going forward. If you look at the Agenda 2030, it's actually a very pragmatic agenda and set of goals that recognizes that sustainable development is only going to happen and can only happen where we have economic growth led and supported through private action. However, we need to always temper that growth and accompany it with social fairness and the idea of environmental sustainability. I like to draw this triangle. I like triangles. You're going to see a lot of triangles in this talk today because I think it's always interesting to compare things in groups of three. But these three aspects, I think, are really fundamental to reaching the goals. And I think it's kind of obvious that we're not going to achieve on them unless we have the support and assistance of an industry like ours, the oil and gas industry, or energy in total to achieve these goals. Another triangle. If you think about those three goals of social viability, commercial needs, and environmental needs, you can also think about them as people, prosperity, and planet. And people is about trying to end poverty and hunger in all forms across the world and ensure that human beings can reach their full potential in dignity and equality. You can also read on the news every day the difficulties that much of our world has in simply feeding themselves, providing light and mobility for their everyday living. And we have a long ways to go to be able to achieve the type of prosperity that we have sitting in this room today around the world. We also need to make sure that we're taking care of the planet and protecting the planet from degradation through sustainable consumption and production. The issues of climate change are pretty well established. They're generally accepted across by most scientists that anthropogenic aspects do play a role in that, and we need to be aware of the impact that we have, particularly in our industry, and particularly around the impact that we have on society in large, and the interpretation that our consumers have about our industry as well. But lastly, we really need to have prosperity so that everyone can, all human beings, can enjoy a prosperous and fulfilling life through this economic, social, and technological process. So trying to balance these aspects is fundamental and essential for good resource management in the future. So this is a slide showing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and I hope most of you have heard about them, whether you've actually gone through and read each of them. You can see they cover a broad spectrum from trying to end poverty through ensuring that people have appropriate food, up through to more complex and perhaps more difficult things to achieve in some ways through the peace, justice, and strong institutions and partnerships for goals across the world. I think it's pretty clear, though, when you look at each of these different goals, I think it's clear that actually we're a very core piece of achieving these goals. Energy and the supply of clean, affordable energy across the globe is absolutely fundamental to achieving all of these goals. And this is really well recognized by the UN and the member states of the UN. As I said, I think our industry is a core part of the economics and social development of the countries in which we operate. And there are many examples of activities by companies large and small that contribute to the attainment of many of these goals, whether it's commitments to reducing emissions, promotion of gender equality, which is actually, I mean, I'm really very happy to look out over the room and see how very well balanced the gender balance in this room is. You don't see that in many institutions around the world. In the US and the UK, the gender balance is nothing like what I see in this room here, so I'm very happy to see that. We have real problems in many countries in achieving that balance. Particularly following International Women's Day for a few weeks ago. I'm glad to see that. Building a medical facility, support for education, these are all things that our industry does as we move into new and challenging environments. But when you look at Sustainable Development Goal number 7 there, it's about affordable and clean energy for all. And so that's clearly the one that it's most obvious that we need to be playing a big role in. So SDG 7 is about affordable and clean energy. And these are just a few kind of interesting facts about the state of energy around the world. So 13% of the globe, that's about 2 billion, about 1 billion to 2 billion people lack access to modern electricity. 3 billion people are still relying on wood, coal, charcoal, animal waste for cooking. And as a result of using that basically solid fuel for combustible fuels for energy and cooking within homes, in 2012 there is estimated there were 4.3 million deaths, most of which were women and girls working in the home environment there. And actually, there's another thing that I've just read recently about this throughout the world is that other impact this has on women and girls is that women are primarily responsible for gathering this combustible fuel around the world. And that's the fact that they're out gathering this fuel is one of the times where they are most likely to have different types of abuse, whether it's rape or other impacts, is when they're actually out gathering this fuel. So it's an interesting thing that by supplying clean energy around the world, you're actually reducing the impact of horrible impacts such as that across the globe. So the power that we have to change the world is really fundamental, and we should never lose sight of that. And finally, we've got a share. Renewable energy is starting to have an impact. The share of renewable energy in final energy consumption is up around 17% in 2015. Obviously, it's a bit higher than that now. And I've got some further statistics will show where that's having an impact as we progress along. I think it's important to mind that oil and gas companies and our industry has a big responsibility to take in this matter. And you can see that in many of the Western oil and gas companies are adding renewable components to their portfolio. So for my company, BP, we're also the largest biofuel energy company in the world, and we have a very large portfolio of wind power that we have also. And on our downstream side, where you're all familiar with our petrol stations, but we are adding to those stations electric charging points, fast charging points at many of our stations around the world now. So if you look at these are the specific targets for Sustainable Development Goal 7. So in part of the Agenda 2030 is not just the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 goals themselves, but a number of specific targets that are met that they want to achieve. And these are the 5 targets for SDG 7. And so effectively they're ensuring universal access to affordable clean energy, increasing the share of renewable energy in the energy mix, doubling the global rate of improvement in energy efficiency, enhancing international cooperation to facilitate access to clean energy, and upgrading technology around the world. I think it's really important. A lot of people think that the Sustainable Development Goals are around getting rid of fossil fuels. This is an anti-fossil fuel message. That's not the case. You'll see nowhere in there is it saying anything negative about fossil fuel technology. What it talks about is actively promoting renewable energy, but the recognition is that it's imperative for petroleum to maintain and continue to be a vital part of the energy mix. We can't stop producing oil and gas. Renewable technologies, certainly by 2030, and I would say even well beyond that, will never be able to completely replace the power and energy supplied by oil and gas. But governments, communities, businesses around the world do need to look at the best way to provide energy, and particularly those places acting in areas that currently lack access to clean and affordable supplies. So there are many places in the world where going in and having renewable technologies such as solar, in the middle of Africa is probably the most appropriate way to do that. But where you do have clean and large sources of hydrocarbons, it makes sense to continue to develop those where they exist. Now, we have a real balance between meeting the balance between making sure that we have adequate energy, food supply, and water supply around the world. And oftentimes we talk about this being a kind of the 3 key points of developing and achieving on these Sustainable Development Goals. It's a delicate balance. Prosperity depends on energy. To raise people from poverty, it's going to require energy to do this. But to be able to meet the needs of all three of these different components is a real challenge. You can't have enough food supply around the world unless you have energy to run the tractors and combines to produce that. You can't have that food if you don't have clean water supply. Energy is necessary to pump that water supply from where it's at source to where it's going to be needed. All of these things all come together and really raises the need and importance for managing these resources going forward. Okay, which kind of brings me to the need for changing the way we do resource management in our industry today. In 2006, the Society of Petroleum Engineers, the international group that looks after the discipline of our petroleum engineering health, and the United Nations group of experts on resource classification recognized that they had a number of common goals around developing a classification system and management systems to better understand and develop our resources. This understanding and agreement led to the development of the 2009 version of the United Nations Framework Classification for Resource, which has as one of its key pillars the SPE, Petroleum Resources Management System. And this is that memorandum of understanding that we drew up at that time. It was recognizing that each of us had goals to develop a classification system on our side within the UNECE to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and for the Society of Petroleum Engineers side to develop a classification system for industry to better exploit their reserves and resources. And we've worked together as organizations from them for many, many times, for many, many years now. Now, oftentimes people ask me, well, what's so complicated about building a classification system? It does seem obvious at first that you would just, count up how many barrels you have and that would be it. But there's actually quite a bit of complexity to classification. And as an example I like to use for this, it maybe is a bit facetious, but I have a lot of records. I love music and I have a lot of records. I don't have one of yours yet, Igor, so you need to make sure that you give me one of your records so I can include it into my collection at some point in time. But one of the things that people who have lots of records do occasionally is we like to classify them. There's nothing I like more than on a cold winter's day to take all of my records off the shelf and reorganize them and put them back on the shelf. And I do it in many, many different ways. So sometimes I classify them by genre. So I'll have all of my country western in one place, then I'll have my ballet scores, then I'll have my opera, and I'll have my rap. So I'll have them all different in different orders. Sometimes I do them by artist. So I'll have all of my, I would have all of my Kirov records together, all of my Gergiev records together. Sometimes I do it by composer. I can also do it by instruments. I can do it by tempo. If I'm making mixtapes, it's always nice to have them done by tempo. Sometimes I do them by the date that the album was published. An interesting one I do sometimes is by when I purchased the records, because I know basically when I bought every record I bought over the years, so I can actually find them that way. But if you think about that, these different ways to classify them, each of them is a valid way to classify them. It would be unique within that classification system, but each of them gives me different information about that collection. I'm looking at that collection of records through a different set of lenses, and I'm seeing different information about it. And that usefulness of that will vary depending on who the user is of that information. So if I told you that my records were organized in one way, and you went and you could find it, but if I didn't tell you how they are organized, if I had them organized by one of these different classifications, and I told you to go in and find something, it would take you some time to do that, because you'd have to first figure out how they're organized, and then maybe you could go through and use that information to find that. But if I ordered them by the date that I purchased them, which is a really useful system for me, because I know when I bought them and I could find something, But if I ordered them like that and I asked you to go in and find a particular record, you wouldn't be able to do it. It would not meet your needs as a stakeholder in trying to find those issues. And that's the same problem we have with oil and gas classification. There are many, many ways to classify oil and gas reserves. You can classify them by the risk of recovery. You can classify them by whether or not it's volumes in place or volumes that might be commercial. You can classify them by whether you've made a final investment decision to go ahead and develop these. There are many ways to do them, and each of them gives different information, and they're useful to different people in different ways. There's also the issue that if you have a classification system and you make it a legal requirement to follow that classification system, like it is in the United States by the Securities and Exchange Commission, it's required there. Here in Russia, you need to follow the classification system, the Russian Federation classification system. If you get it wrong, there can be real impacts. In 2004, there were a number of oil and gas companies that were brought before the officials in the United States for having falsified, that was the word that was being used in the industry, that they were falsifying their reserves. In actual fact, they weren't falsifying their reserves, they were just not classifying them according to the rules of the Securities and Exchange Commission completely. The volumes that they were quoting were completely valid volumes, but they didn't necessarily meet all of the requirements to be called proved reserves at that time by the SEC. And it was a very interesting time. There was huge problems within the industry. Many people were fined. There were people that went to jail. People lost their jobs over this. And they weren't just small companies. It was big companies such as Shell, El Paso, which were Devon, very large, very large companies were having these problems. It wasn't something that was just a small company issue. And I like to quote a few comments about the types of things that people were doing there, perhaps, is a famous company misrepresented reserves with the collusion of the board of directors. Application of revised rules significantly altered management's previous estimates. So by changing the rules, people didn't know how to apply them correctly and made errors along those lines. Risk of mitigation that the in-place results in revision of field reserves, so not actually understanding how much volume you had in place. And finally, management found to be trading shares prior to release of revised reserves estimates. So if I know there's going to be a big reduction, I might sell all my shares now. If I knew there was going to be a big addition, I'd go out and buy them. So these are all sorts of things that are happening, and those of you who read the papers and follow the industry, you might be able to think you're trying to guess which companies might be involved with these different problems. But the interesting thing is I took these 4 anecdotes from a lecture that was given at the Institute of Mining and Metallurgy. But the interesting thing is that lecture was given in 1911. So these sorts of problems have been going on for a very, very long time. People have been arguing over how to do reserves classification over all this time, and we still haven't gotten it right. And so that was really the emphasis of the United Nations expert group and the СПбГУ to try to come together to develop and build a classification system that would hopefully solve these problems and allow us to build the type of resource management system that we need if we're going to deliver on the Agenda 2030 and those Sustainable Development Goals. And if we look at reserves guidance just of the last 50 or 60 years here, stuff has changed. The way we look at doing volumetrics has changed significantly. If you look back in the 1960s, the American Petroleum Institute had a number of reserves definitions, and really those reserves definitions were not substantially different from the reserves definitions that were being used in 1911. They were really about the same definitions at that time there. They were what I like to call volumetric based. The concern was all about what's the volume in place and then what's my recovery factor of recovering those. So it was looking at really the volumes that are sort of in situ, and how much of that percentage of that volume do I think I might potentially produce with time. They were also very rules-based, meaning that people set up rules that said you had to meet this criteria, and this criteria to be able to call those volumes a reserve. So, for example, as that if you were trying to identify the extent of an oil column, you had to have penetrated the contact. So if you have an oil field, you would have to be able to say you'd penetrated the oil-water contact to be able to identify what's the areal extent of that field. So they had lots and lots of rules like that to define what was needed there. And then in 1978, the United States Securities Exchange Commission published their own reserves rules, which were based very much on the API rules, and they introduced a bunch of other very rules-based requirements there. In 2000, the SPE updated its definitions. So we really had, in the West, those were really the three main definition pools that we looked at, the API, the SEC, and the SPE, and all of their reserve definitions were fairly similar. But then, as I mentioned to you, in 2004, there were a large number of scandals throughout the industry where there were major debookings when people realized that they were not, the definitions were not being used consistently and compliantly across the industry. It wasn't actually just the oil and gas industry. The mining fields were having the same problems at that time as well, with a lot of major debookings and scandals there. After that, so I think we entered sort of an area of period of uncertainty where how we were using reserves definitions became very problematic. And people had the industry, investors lacked a lot of confidence in how to view oil and gas companies, and we recognized that something had to be done. So this is why the SPE and the UN came together to start looking at this. And we entered a phase where we have more project and principles-based sets of rules. And through this was the Society of Petroleum Engineers Petroleum Resource Management System definitions from 2007, leading up through to the 2009 United Nations Framework Classification. Now, what's different about these rules versus these systems versus the older volumetric system is that, first off, they're project-based, meaning that rather than classifying the reserves associated with a field or a deposit, we're classifying the reserves based on the project that we're going to be putting in place. So you can't have reserves unless you have a project defined to produce them. And that's the key difference between there. So this is a fundamental difference that's much akin to the different classifications of music I talked about a few moments ago. The other one is that rather than defining the rules for how to do every assessment, they've defined principles about which we need to honor. So whereas the earlier systems, said you must do this, this, and this to make your assessment, we're now saying, think about these issues. Make sure that you're calculating things in a manner that's appropriate for this. So these types of principles could be, your estimate needs to be evidence-based. Okay, you can't base your evidence on what you think or hope something might be. You need to show me that you have evidence for that. Now, what that evidence is may vary, and I don't necessarily define what that evidence is, but you need to show me, if I ever ask you to, that you can justify the estimate that you've made based on that evidence. And this gives you much more flexibility to use modern technologies and changing technologies, because technologies change with time. 25 years ago, we weren't producing the amount of volumes that we're producing today out of shales across the world, because they weren't viewed as being something that were producible. But today, 25% of United States oil production comes from stuff that we didn't even recognize as reserves 25 years ago. So this is looking at these sorts of advances within technology that gives us the benefit by using a principles-based system. So I mentioned also that the use of any classification system really is influenced by who the stakeholders are. So who are the people who are going to be using this system? And I like to think that there's a number of different ways to look at this. So we have effectively a number of different stakeholders. We've got those people who are internal stakeholders. So these are the people in the companies generally that are using these estimates. They're actually both building them. So there's the engineers, geoscientists within the company, the finance people that are actually building the estimates. And then there's the management who are sort of the users of these estimates, making business decisions based off of these estimates. So these are internal stakeholders. They'll be using the information on a daily basis, and they'll have really strong knowledge about it. They are very sophisticated users of this data. They understand it, they understand the risks associated with it, and they understand the impact that getting an estimate wrong could have, or what's the sensitivity of that estimate. Okay. There are also external influencers. These are the people that set the standards or set requirements for reporting. So these are generally your governments, effectively, so that are setting up what is the classification system that you need to use. How are you going to be reporting this information back? These users are similarly sophisticated in their understanding of the issues associated with reserves classification and reserves development and production, but they're probably not as knowledgeable about the specifics of any particular field. So any particular development, any particular project, they won't be able to go in and understand all of the risks associated with any project, like the internal stakeholders who are actually developing it. So these external influencers are trying to come up with a classification system for them that will help them get as much information out of the businesses to tell them and understand what the risks are associated with them, so that they can be sure they're making the best policy decisions around the oil and gas volumes. So they want an idea of what's the ultimate recovery that I'm going to produce from this basin versus this basin, so I can set up a government policy around energy distribution so that I know I'm going to have oil and gas in the right place, energy in the right place where I need it. That's different from what the internal stakeholders want, because the internal stakeholders, if we make the assumption that it's a private company, their goal is to make money for that company. Their goal is to continue producing and to be able to continue to invest in new developments. So what they're looking for is to make sure they're making the right project decisions on a case-by-case business, so that each business decision they make is the right one for their industry. Then we have a third class of stakeholders in resource classification who are the external users. And these are the investors. So this may be everybody in this room who owns shares at an oil and gas company. This could be banks that are loaning money to those oil and gas companies to be able to go out and make investments. These are people who typically are not very sophisticated. They're not engineers, they're not geoscientists, they don't understand the problems, they probably don't understand the risks associated with the developments. All they're seeing is what's in the annual report that's sitting in front of them, and they're making or press releases that are released about the companies, that they're trying to make the assessments of, should I be investing my money into this company or to this company? Should I be loaning them money? And what they want to see is they want effectively assurance. They're not really interested in what the upside is. You know, what might come out of this field. I'm loaning you money. I want to be confident that I'm going to get a return on that investment. I only want to know what I'm absolutely certain I'm going to produce. And in our industry, we generally call those proved reserves. So these external users are usually only interested in proved reserves, those volumes that I have real high confidence that I'm going to produce. So completely opposite of what the external influencers want to see. Those external influencers want to know about everything. They want to know what about the future potential is. So you can see that stakeholders have different needs, and to come up with a resource classification system that meets all these needs is a real challenge. So this sort of kind of sums that up, the comments that I just made there. But we do have conflicts, I think, between the stakeholders, and that's a real problem because what one stakeholder may view as the most useful information may not be the same that another stakeholder needs. And it's not really clear that there is one answer that will meet all the needs, although with the United Nations framework classification, we are working very hard towards achieving that goal. So what are the real principles of classification? I said that this is a principles-based system, so clearly we need to be able to state what those principles are if we're going to be able to apply them consistently. So this list here is the list of principles of classification that was drawn up by the Society of Petroleum Engineers, and I think it's a pretty good list, actually. So first off is that we need to understand both the reservoir and the in-place resources. So we have to understand what the pool is like, what the deposit looks like. This is both understanding the geology about it and understanding what are the static kind of potential that I can ultimately have from this volume. The second major principle is that it's project-based, as I mentioned before. We're only classifying as recoverable volumes those projects that have a chance of commerciality. And by commerciality, I mean technological, economic, legal, social, environmental, and regulatory issues. All of those things need to come together for a project to be commercial. So we're only classifying the portion of the resources of the volumes in place as reserves if they can be shown to have a chance of commerciality going forward. We then categorize also these volumes based on their uncertainty, their recoverable uncertainty. So how confident are we that we're going to actually be able to recover these, and what's the range of uncertainty associated with the volumes? You know, what's our 10% likelihood of achieving this volume? What's the 50% likelihood? What's the 90% likelihood? Understanding those ranges. Our base case always uses a forecast of future conditions. This means commercial and economic conditions. Oil and gas, if we didn't have any economic constraints on oil and gas development, you know, we could produce very high recovery factors from every field. But it doesn't make sense to do that in many cases because some fields have greater complexity associated with them. So we need to take into mind and consideration what are oil and gas prices, what are oil and gas production costs going to be in the future. And classically, the base case for this, we'll use a forecast of our future conditions, but we'll often look at historical conditions or conditions of the day to get a better idea of what the value is of a field at any one given time. We want to make sure that we have sufficient granularity of the classification that we can see what the project management is, what projects are going to be managed and how they're going to be done. We don't limit the use of techniques for estimation to either one type. You can make the estimates either deterministically or probabilistically. And there are cases where each of those is the more appropriate tool to use. And in fact, in most cases, I would say most companies probably use a mixture of both. At all stages of development, you'll use a combination of them. You know, obviously, early in the development of a field where you know very little about it, you need to have a much higher appreciation of the uncertainty. So you'll be more likely to use probabilistic methods. As you develop the field and you drill more and more wells, you probably can go to a deterministic approach because you'll have a very good understanding of the deposition, of what the petrophysical properties of the rocks are, et cetera, how the fluids are going to be produced. We define that reserves and resources are always estimated in terms of what we're actually going to be selling, not just producing. So if we use a portion of that for fuel usage or if there's some flare, those are generally not considered to be sales products. So the reserves are only the volumes that we'll actually be selling and be able to take to market. Reserves allocation is based on a contractual entitlement. So as a company, I can only recognize those reserves that I have an entitlement to. And this is very interesting. This is another place where you'll see a breakdown in classification needs by the different stakeholders. A government that has an oil gas field in it, they have the rights to that field. They have the ownership, the national endowment of those volumes in perpetuity. So, they have no limits on how long it can take to produce that volume. But oftentimes, a company only has a limited period of license ownership of that field. So maybe I have 20 years to develop this field, but in actual fact, the field could be producing for 40 years. I'm only going to be able to recognize as reserves for myself as a company those volumes that will be produced during that time period that I have entitlement to it. The government isn't interested in that. They want to know what volume is going to be produced from the field over field life. So right off there's a difference. An investor who's investing in a company, again, they're really only interested in, well, what are you going to produce? What's going to be the return on my investment with you? So this is another key factor that does change the way we interpret reserves and resources. Interestingly, sometimes two different companies operating in the same field may have different entitlement calculations about how they're going to be reimbursed for that production. So two different companies may come up with very different reserves estimates on the same field because of the fact that they have different entitlements to them. And lastly, these principles of classifications apply to all types of resources, both conventional, unconventional, whether they're difficult to produce or not. So this is just kind of a quick summary of some of the key issues around reserves classification. So the SPE defines classification using this figure that's in the upper left there, that your recoverable resources are fundamental and are based on the combination or sort of the nexus of the reservoir, the project that's going to be placed in that, and then the legal entitlement that you have to the property. So you need to understand each of those three aspects to be able to calculate what your reserves and resources are. So kind of going back to those principles that I just put up there is you have to understand your reservoir. That was the first principle. It needs to be project-based, so you need to understand what that project is. And then lastly, you can only book what's the entitlement to. So those three things come together to make those estimates of those resources. And it's really important that you effectively, you're looking at both a series of technical and commercial tests to make this estimate. I think most of you in the room are technical people, so we understand, I think, all the factors that go into making those reserves and resources estimates, understanding your fluids, understanding your geology, understanding the limitations of what you can physically drill and produce from. But there are equally a large number of commercial impacts and tests that must be looked at. And I think they sort of come together into four, maybe five kind of categories here. So first, it's access and entitlement. So can I get to the hydrocarbons, and do I have entitlement to them? So basically, do I own them? Do I have the right to produce these volumes? Second is market and sales connectivity. So if I produce this volume, is somebody going to buy it? And am I going to be able to deliver it to them? So, there's lots of gas in this world that is in completely unreachable locations where we can't get a pipeline to it, or we don't have the facilities to be able to produce them. So if you can't produce it, you can't get those volumes to market, then they really have no value. So you need to check that effectively, can I sell it and get rid of it? Third is authorization and commitment. So am I going to do this? Do I have permission to do this? So has a government given me permission to go ahead and produce these volumes? And am I committed to doing it? Am I going to actually develop these volumes going forward? So that's the third test. It's basically, am I going to do it? And finally, economic case validation. Does it actually make sense to do this? Does it make money? Does this project make money? Or does it meet some sort of strategic goal that I have going forward? And I need to test that economic case case works for me going forward. So these are the 4 things looked at, and I could actually add a 5th one perhaps that's relatively new in our thinking, that's in line with Sustainable Development Goals, is does this meet the social and economic needs of the people in the locations in which we're working? So I think that's another key thing that we need to think about. Looking at the plot below is a graphic that describes the Society of Petroleum Engineers classification system. It's based on, you can think of this as kind of a 2-dimensional plot that I have, that resources are booked based on the total volume that's initially in place. Some of it's recoverable, some of it's not recoverable. Some of it has been discovered, some of it is yet to be discovered. So those volumes that are yet to be discovered are called prospective resources. And they're ones that I have an idea that I'm going to be able to, that I hope I'll be able to find based on my basin analysis. Then there's a key line there that sits above that prospective resources box there. That is the point of discovery. So this is the act of making a discovery. And once I've discovered a volume, those volumes become contingent resources. And contingent resources just means these are volumes that are currently sub-commercial and that I've not yet to make an investment decision on them, but they're known hydrocarbons, and I have an idea of a project that I can put in place to ultimately develop these. The next line between the contingent resources and reserves is the line of commerciality. So this is the point at which I've made a final investment decision and I'm going to develop those volumes going forward. So you can kind of think of this, on the right-hand side of that plot there, it says increasing chance of commerciality. As I learn more and more about my fields, the likelihood of them coming to development increases. I then classify and categorize based on the range of uncertainty. And these are the words proved, probable, and possible that we use within the industry. And effectively, proved volumes are those volumes that I am reasonably certain that will be produced from the field. Probable ones are volumes that I'm as likely as not to produce. And possible volumes are ones that I'm unlikely to be produced, but there is an upside possibility that they will be recovered. If we use statistics in this, which are often used, is we generally consider that I have a 90% probability of equaling or achieving my, exceeding my proved reserves. I have a 50% likelihood of exceeding my probable reserves, and I have a 10% likelihood of exceeding my possible reserves. And so this is the way classification systems is used within our industry based on the petroleum resources management system. They also go further, subdivide the classifications into these ones, as you can see here, that describe even more the increasing chance of commerciality. So this allows me within my business to classify and understand and make sure that I'm making the right business decisions. Now, interestingly, most stock exchanges where I am releasing and publishing information, the only information that I publish is the volume that are my proved reserves. So that one little tiny portion there, let me look at this previous plot there, the only thing I'm actually publishing in this whole kind of matrix of volumes is let's see if this works here, is just that volume there that sits in that proved box. That's all that's being externally reported. All the other volumes I'm saving and using within the company to make sure I'm optimizing things, but I'm only reporting that small volume there. Now, in some cases, in addition to those sorts of filings, governments also look for a more full-bodied estimate. I know they do here in Russia. You do need to file your full resource estimates here. I'll skip over that. So once you've defined a system like this, we need to make sure that we define a system of definitions, specifications, and guidelines so that we have consistency of application in the estimation of these volumes across the industry. So that if Company A is making the estimate and then Company B comes in and makes a similar estimate, I know there'll be reasons why any differences exist in those. So effectively, you can think of the definitions kind of describe the classification framework. The specifications are the additional rules that are necessary. So the definitions are kind of the principles. Specifications are kind of rules that must be applied, and guidelines are assistance to making the estimates. Okay, and within the UNFC, we look at the criteria around what reserves and resources, how they're defined, looking at three different main principles. First is that they need to be economic to extract, so they need to be commercially feasible, as I said before. They need to be technically feasible to extract, and they need to be geologically well-defined with high confidence. So you can see we use the kind of the alphabetism of E, F, and G to refer to these. And you can think about it, if you take a project and sort of define its criteria based around whether it's economic and social viability, its project feasibility, and its geological uncertainty, you can kind of see that you could place this within a cube someplace. And this is, in some ways this seems complex to do this in 3 dimensions, but it's the way we actually address a business problem within our industry at all times. We always identify a field. So we have an understanding of the geology of that field, we define a project on that, and we look at the uncertainty associated with that project development, and then we check the economics of that project. So we really always look at our project development under these 3 different criteria. So I think it's really important to use that in the classification framework as we're doing here. So as I said, these 3 axes, economic and social viability, which includes environmental issues as well, of course, the project feasibility, and the geologic knowledge axis. And how we use this system within the UNFC is to codify it in such a way that we subdivide each of these axes into clear boxes of criteria where we can define the principles behind how we do that classification. And we've encoded this into a very simple set of specifications that allow consistency of use between different users. And so to give an example of this, so we have these 3 different axes, as I said. To give you an example of this, I'll walk you through the E axis, which is the economic and social viability axis there. So effectively, you can think about this. The E axis is the degree of favorability of social economic conditions and establishing the commercial viability of the project. Now, this includes all considerations of things like market prices, relevant legal, regulatory, environmental, social, and contractual conditions. We subdivide it into 3 categories, E1, 2, and 3. E1 is considered the best, so you would be classifying yourself as E1 if you've met all requirements for each of these individual issues. You'd classify yourself as E3 if you were much more immature in meeting those definitions. Okay? And if we go and look at, these are the definitions for that category. You can see they're very simple and succinct. So E1 means that extraction and sale has been confirmed to be economically viable. So this is something that I can do and make money on. E2 says that extraction and sale is expected to become economically viable in the foreseeable future. And you can debate what the definition of foreseeable means. It might vary depending on what the type of project is or who's making the assessment. And then finally, E3 is that the extraction and sale is not expected to become viable in the foreseeable future, or that the evaluation is basically too early a stage for me to make that assessment. And as I said, economically viable includes far more than just market conditions. It also includes all those issues around environmental and social impacts that go into the development of that project. Okay. So I can go through and walk you through similarly for the F-axis and the E-axis, each of these criteria as well, but I think I'll skip that in the interest of time here. Is that we can walk through each of these different categories. But you can see we've broken the F-axis into 4 categories and the G-axis into 4 categories. Okay. So how it works then is if we look at the framework here, if I was to take this cell up here in the upper left there, that's the E1 F1, G1 cell within the matrix. So, and we read the definitions. So we just read this one here. The E1 is that extraction and sale has been confirmed to be economically viable. The F1 axis there, that point there, defines that the feasibility of extraction by a defined development project or mining operation has been confirmed. And finally, the G1 says that these are quantities that are associated with a known deposit that can be estimated with a high level of confidence. Now, the way you use this is you don't just look at each of those three definitions independently. You read that all as a paragraph or as a story that defines and describes this project. So to be in that cell, I have to meet all of these different definitions and these different criteria. And if you go and take the Society of Petroleum Engineers definitions, which are a bit more old-fashioned and are somewhat linear in their development, they have a definition of proved reserves, which is this one here. Proved reserves are those quantities of petroleum which, by analysis of geoscience and engineering data, can be estimated with reasonable certainty to be commercially recoverable from a given date forward from known reservoirs and under defined economic conditions, operating methods, and government regulations. I think you can see that that definition is very similar to the definition that we've come to using these three independent criteria. And the powerful thing about using these independent criteria is that we have much more granularity to describe and learn about our projects in them. And I think it's particularly of value when you look at some of the cells that exist in here that wouldn't be represented in the SPE system. So the cells that are colored on here are those cells that have direct correlation to the SPE system. But the real valuable things to me actually are those cells that aren't colored, because I think they give a lot more insight into your reserves and resources. For example, a contingent resource under the SPE definition, you can't tell whether the volumes are not being progressed due to either economic conditions or due to technological conditions. They go into the same bucket whether for either of those two reasons. But with the SPE system, we can define that a volume might be at an E1 level of development, but an F2 level of feasibility. That's very different from a field or project that's at E2 F2 or E2 F1. They're describing different criteria for what are the barriers to developing those volumes forward. And I like to think that the real power of a good classification system is that it's an aid to development. It's giving you information about what you need to do to progress volumes. So in some ways, it's not the cells or the categories that are important, it's the barriers between them. It's why I've chosen to put this as an F1 as opposed to an F2 or an F3. Understanding what are the barriers to moving things forward. You can get real value and aid yourselves in progressing those volumes going forward. Okay. So as I said to you, we have a number of different classes of variables here. And as I said, these colored ones are directly analogous to the Society of Petroleum Engineers. And in fact, I can take the UNFC and present it as a 2D representation, much like that SPE system was before. I don't really like doing this because I think we lose the value of the three dimensions, but it can be done if you want to do it. And the nice thing that you can get when you do this is that you can align the systems. So you can take the UNFC 2009 and align it directly with the PRMS and see how volumes could be classified under one system and mapped or bridged to the other system. And one of the things we found is that where we found that there are perhaps dislocations or places where they don't align properly, well, the PRMS is looking to change things. So very recently, the PRMS has subdivided that contingent resources category to account for the differences between potentially commercial and non-commercial categories. So they're starting to enhance their system to be more similar to ours. Now, the other thing I haven't talked about is that the UNFC is not just a system for petroleum. It can be used for a number of different extractive and even non-extractive resources. So CRISCO is effectively the mining industry's equivalent of the Society of Petroleum Engineers. They produce the classification systems for mining applications. And we've also taken and aligned the UNFC to the CRISCO template of systems. And in fact, we've aligned the UNFC to a number of different systems, including the Russian Federation oil and gas definitions, and looking forward to doing that for the mining definitions as well. We've also aligned them to the International Atomic Energy Commission's association's definitions for nuclear fuels. It's been aligned to the Chinese petroleum and mining systems. So we're continuously expanding the alignment to these different extractive industries as well. And we've also found that the UNFC can also be used for resources other than typical extractive. I'll talk in a few minutes about how we're using it to define renewable energy resources. And we're also looking forward to introducing a program to look at water resources, which I think is of great interest in Russia as well. Alignment is very powerful, because what alignment does is allows us to make an estimate in one classification system and then go through the UNFC and actually report those volumes in another system. So, for example, if I made an assessment of my oil and gas reserves using the Russian Federation system, I can bridge those definitions into the UNFC framework classification system. And then I could then take those estimates there and basically bridge them back to the Petroleum Resources Management System, and only have to make my estimate one time. I could report them back into different systems. And I similarly could do that to all other alignment systems. So if I wanted to take these PRMS reserves and report them as they would be in the Chinese system, again, I could just follow through this umbrella classification and do this system. And this is what's really unique about the UNFC, to be able to do this, this classification and changing systems. It allows people to have more flexibility to continue to work with their home system, the system that they feel most comfortable with, but report them for either government requirements or for any industry, any industry requirements that are necessary into that. So effectively, if you think about it, the UNFC is this generic principles-based system. It's based on these three fundamental criteria around economic, social viability, field project status, feasibility, and geological knowledge. We subdivide these different criteria into different categories to add more information about the systems. So effectively, it's a very powerful tool to be looking at resource progression. And if you take those different categories within the UNFC, I like to think about how a field project is progressed for getting back to our principles around resource management. What I have across, the arrow across the top there describes a number of different stages in the development of a project. So there's the access stage where you get rights to a license area. Then there's a stage where we're appraising projects, selecting the right project, adding definition to it, beginning to build it, and then finally operating it. And this is really kind of normal phases that a project goes through in development. So, we have our exploration phase, we find something, we come up with a project to develop it, we get approval to do it, and we build it, and then we put it on production. That's sort of the normal process of any oil and gas field going through to development. But I always like to say that's really the boring part of our job. That's kind of everyday stuff going through and doing that. I think the real exciting stuff, and when you really consider it, is when you make a discovery, you start to look at a project, you probably aren't going to do everything at once in that field. You're going to actually do this field in multiple stages in development. So, I make my discovery, and I come up with a project that I take forward for development. But associated with that project, there were some other sequences that I'm not really very comfortable with and I haven't included in the project, or there's something I understand but it's not quite economic yet, and so I'm not going to do that project today. And then in fact, by having made that discovery, there might be some other pools that look very similar on seismic around it that now I've reduced the risk around, and so I've got more prospectivity there that's got a very low risk in it. And if I think about these sorts of things here, this is really the future of those fields. Because I want to make sure that I'm going to be developing these fields over not just a 10-year project life, but over a 50-year life of that field, and recognizing and exploiting all of the hydrocarbons that are in that field. And a classification system that is really only geared around developing stuff and progressing it forward, and not recognizing these other volumes that are on hold and that have some sort of difficulty in production, some sort of barrier to those things progressing forward, would really be missing the potential that these other projects have. And the UNFC gives us the capability to not only identify these, but to quantify them for future production and development. And that's real power of the UNFC going forward. And it's not just, it's not just make-believe. This is something that really happens in real life here. And on a conceptual basis here, you can think about, typically, consider this the production life of a field. So I've got a period here where I've produced stuff here. I may have an activity plan that goes out for the next couple of years. It's defining what's going to be produced. I have a business plan that might be 10 years that sits out. And those two plans will probably be fed mostly by my proved and probable reserves that I've already identified. But I'm also going to have a life of field depletion plan that's going to look at what's this field going to do over its full lifetime. And in that, I'm going to identify subsequent projects that I'm going to be able to do over the lifetime of that field and add on to extend the life of the field and increase the reserves associated with that. And again, this is not just make-believe. This is something that really happens. And this is a plot from the Prudhoe Bay field in Alaska. It's on the north slope of Alaska, far north of the Arctic Circle. It was the first field I worked on for BP, actually. It started production in 1969, so it's been around for a long time. And it's going to be going on producing for many, many more years after this as well, I can assure you. We have development plans that for drilling that go out to 2040. So it's going to be producing for a long time, this field. It's about 20 billion barrel field in place. When I was working on it back in the 80s, we thought we were going to cover 10 to 12 billion barrels, but we've already recovered 15. So, and we'll produce far more than that with time. So this is a plot of the profiles of additional recovery from the field, and you can see the number of different technologies that have been applied to the field to add more and more barrels of oil in this field, whether it's coiled tubing drilling, sidetracking wells, the use of hydraulic fractures, stimulations, workovers, non-rig workovers, all these new technologies that we're taking forward. And it's all about being intrinsically invested in the development of advances in technology. And this is why university relationships with industry are so important, because really the big advances in technology comes out of universities. And so we're very happy to continue to work with schools such as St. Petersburg in developing this. So kind of returning to my idea around resource management, we have this social license to operate. And if we think about the flow of materials within the oil and gas industry, there's really sort of kind of three big principles that we've identified that we need to consider. Is really we need to make sure that we have a social license to operate, because if we don't have good relationships with our partners in the communities around, we can have real problems. The oil and gas industry has been pretty lucky about this. There are places, you've all read, I'm sure, about some of the issues that have happened in Nigeria, where there have been disruption of productions in the oil fields by a number of different companies there. There have been some limited issues in South America as well, but generally, I think communities get along well with oil and gas development. It's not always the case with mining. There have been an awful lot of issues historically where there have been social issues in the mining industry around that. So understanding that is really, really important. It's really important to have the idea about zero waste and zero harm, that we're not damaging the environment and that we're cleaning up after ourselves when we're doing it. And one way we can do that is through the principle about comprehensive recovery, is that we only damage a piece, we only go into an area one time. So when we go into an area to develop it, we want to make sure that we're developing everything that we can at once there. So this is particularly important in the mining industry. There have been historical cases where people have gone into an area and mined out all the gold in that area, and they've left all the tailings, they've taken the gold and they've left, and then they come back and realize, actually there's a lot of uranium there as well, so let's go back in and mine out the uranium. Or so basically they disrupt the community, they disrupt the land, they disrupt the environment multiple times. So the idea is about comprehensive recovery, making sure we're going in and we're taking out everything that's there and taking advantage of that. And again, the UNFC system is really around that principle that we're trying to manage our flows in this really balanced way around this system. I mentioned, just going to close, getting ready to close up here, is that I've mentioned that the UNFC is project-based, and this is kind of the definition of a simple project here. We have an accumulation, we have a processing plant, we take it to, and we'd have sales. It works the same way for mining. You have a deposit, they extract it, they process it, they sell it. But interestingly, if you think about renewable energy projects, it's really very similar. Okay, we have a renewable energy resource, we have extraction and processing that converts it, and we sell these products. So why can't we assess renewable energy projects by what their resources are as well? Well, you might initially jump to the conclusion that, well, the sun's always going to shine, so it's infinite. So how can you have resources? Because they're infinite. There's an infinite amount of wind. It's never going to stop blowing. The sun's never going to stop shining in foreseeable future. But the difference is the projects aren't. So when you build a windmill, it has a lifespan. That windmill project is not infinite. It has a definable time period when it's going to be producing energy. It has operating expenses and capital expenses to maintain it, just the way an oil and gas development does. Same thing for a solar farm. That solar farm has a lifespan for each of those solar cells. It has CapEx and OpEx that goes into its development. Same thing for a bioenergy process. So we're looking to take these renewable energy projects and look at the characteristics they share with fossil fuel and minerals projects to develop a set of systems around the classification of this. And we have done this successfully now. And the UNFC is allowing for a consistent language and terminology around renewable energies and non-renewable energies, fossil fuels primarily. This is really interesting, I think, for governments and for planners, is that now you can actually see and compare the advantages and potential pitfalls of an oil and gas project versus a renewable energy project in the same region. And you actually make some really good decisions about what's the right way to provide energy for your region. Because renewable energy projects are not, there are many, many advantages to them, but there are potential issues with renewable projects. They're very land intensive. You need a lot of land to be able to build the type of solar arrays that are necessary to fulfill energy needs within a regions. Many solar cells need certain rare earth minerals to make them work, which may lead to need for more mining. So there are issues with these, and to actually be able to compare and contrast them on all different frameworks, I think is a real benefit in going forward. So there are challenges to doing all this, but we are addressing those. And just kind of to end up here, I'm going to show a couple of slides here just very at the end here that have just been published as part of the BP Energy Outlook that's produced every year around this time. And you can find it on the BP homepage. It's really very interesting reading to go through the outlook. But what we do is each year we make a forecast of what's going to be happening over the next 10, 20 years in energy use around the world for all different fuel types, both demand and supply. When I started in the industry back in the 80s, we were concerned that we were going to hit a peak supply. We were going to run out of oil and gas. And that was what was going to define peak oil. Now it's very clear that what's going to define peak oil is actually peak demand. It's when people are going to start wanting to have oil and gas. But that said, it's going to be a long time before oil and gas becomes becomes a small share of the primary energy mix. Certainly within all of the career lifespan of all of you in this room here can be very well assured that you're going to have a valid and valuable future in the oil and gas industry. So I'm plotting here the growth of energy consumption, and this energy consumption growth is really being driven by increasing prosperity around the world to develop that. But one thing that I find that's really interesting on this plot here is you look at the comparison is the fact that we like to think of the 19th century as being the century of coal, where coal was the primary energy source. And we like to think that the 20th century was the growth of oil and gas as the fuel of choice for there, and that the 21st century is going to be renewables. But if you actually look at the statistics, there was more coal used in the 20th century. In fact, there's more coal used today than there was in the 19th century. There's more oil and gas being used today than there was in the 20th century. What we're seeing is that when a new energy source comes in, it's not replaced. It doesn't replace the previous one. It supplants it. It adds. We've used more energy. So we're still using that coal that we've been using for 200 years. We're still using the oil and gas that we've been using for 100 years. And you can already start to see it here in this plot here, is that the expectation is that renewables are going to come on top of that, and we're just going to continue to have more growth there. Now, we do need to look at this as a culture. We need to make sure that we're making the change to renewables because it's absolutely essential. And the renewables share, as you can see on the plot on the right there, does increase, over to 2040, but perhaps not as much as it needs to if we're going to meet the climate change goals that we have from the Paris Accord and others. It's interesting to see where energy is used. I like this plot on the left here. Is broken up by the different types of uses of energy. So it's broken up into transport. That's both automobiles, shipping, and automobiles, trucks, and shipping, which people often forget about. Shipping is a huge use of energy around the world. Industry, so that's actually constructing things around the world, making things. Non-combusted oil and gas is basically uses in plastics is the primary use there. So as you can see, the impact of oil and gas is actually quite large there. And finally, building use, so heating and cooling. And the great increase you see there is really about a massive increase in air conditioning around the world. People want their houses to be cooler. So there's huge growth in that around the world. It's always quite interesting how little of percentage of oil and gas use is actually related to transport. And if you break this out into the percentage there that's actually used by automobiles, it's very, very small. So the transition to electric cars is really important. Don't get me wrong there, it's absolutely important. But it's not going to have a huge impact on the amount of oil and gas used around the world. Other interesting thing is to look at the speed of the transition. This is a very interesting plot, I think, is that what it is it's plotting the share of world energy for each of these different fuel sources And they're normalized to the year in which the different fuel source achieved 1% market share. Okay, so for oil, this was in 1877. For nuclear, it was 1974. For renewables, it's 2006. And you can see the growth of these. Basically, all the different fuels tended to follow the same sort of growth market along those years there. This great increase in oil after 40 years was really due to the change from coal to oil in shipping, and the great increase there was, if you do the math there, you can see that's World War I, where the growth of shipping industry really expanded significantly. But going back to here, you can see that renewables is tracking faster than any other fuel source has other than nuclear. And we're actually expecting it to continue to increase faster than any other share. But whether it's going to be able to go as fast as that rapid transition to really meet all the requirements of the Paris Accord is going to be a real challenge to see. So looking forward to seeing what happens moving forward. So the UNFC is supported by member states across the world, the Russian Federation, China, Nordic countries, Africa. Really, we've got really worldwide use of this. We're always interested to have new attendees and new people take an interest in the project. And I've put up two links there for you. One is the link to our program at the UN, so you can get some more information. You can actually get some of the publications that I've talked about here. And also BP, if you're interested in looking at that Outlook report. Urge all of you to have a look at this work and to see how your assessments of reserves can come into really effective and sustainable resource management in the future. So I'll stop there and be very happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Так, уважаемые коллеги, значит, пожалуйста, задавайте вопросы господину Макдональду. Есть несколько здесь человек, которые с микрофонами. Пожалуйста, у кого есть вопросы? Не стесняйтесь. Господин Шпильман.
Спасибо большое, Дэвид. Очень интересный доклад. Но вот один вопрос, который я не знаю. Когда нужно сравнить нефть и газ в условных топливах, я хорошо знаю, как это делать, а когда нужно сравнить киловатт-час и тонну нефти, как вы это делаете, что потом получаются такие графики, хотя бы подход какой?
Yeah, I don't have any graphs with me. That's an interesting question, is how do you convert and compare these commodities when the output measurement is so different? It's a very good question, because it's not always clear. You can take a barrel of oil and calculate what are the amount of joules that are associated with that barrel of oil if you were to put it into a power plant, and then compare that to the output from a solar array. You'd come up with one equivalency factor. But I could also say, well, I'm going to take that energy from that solar array and put it into a car, and I'm also going to take that gallon of petrol and put that into a car. And that would get a completely different split between the value of oil and gas and solar in that way. So this is an area that we don't have solved right now. We are looking to see how to do equivalencies in a most appropriate manner. What I suspect it's going to be is you're going to need to do equivalencies based on sort of the output. So what are you using that oil and gas for from that project? Is that oil and gas from that project going to be going into household heating, for example? Then you can compare it directly to saying, here's a gas heated house, here's an electrically heated house. What are the costs associated with doing that? But we do still have quite a bit of work to do on that. Now, the one thing we can compare consistently, though, is on the economics of a project. and the feasibility of the projects. Those are directly comparable between the two different types of projects.
Спасибо. Еще вопросы, пожалуйста. Вот там, коллеги.
Спасибо большое, Дэвид. Очень интересная спич. У меня вопрос такой. Сейчас Российская Федерация озадачена вопросами освоения арктической зоны Российской Федерации. Ваше мнение о возможном участии иностранных компаний, в частности, компании BP, в большой линейке проектов, которые на сегодняшний день есть у нас? И это проекты, в основном, которые реализуют компании «Газпром», «Газпромнефть», «Новатэк», «Роснефть». И были попытки у «Лукойла» также. Ваше мнение, каковы перспективы в освоении месторождений? Спасибо.
I'm sorry, I missed the very beginning of your question. Could you say the very beginning again? I wasn't sure what types of projects you were referring to.
Yes, sure. Каковы перспективы иностранных компаний в освоении Арктики, российской Арктики, арктической зоны Российской Федерации? Как вы считаете? И в частности, ваше мнение о компании BP? Спасибо. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm afraid I can't answer that question because frankly I don't know. I don't know what our plans are, and we would have to wait on that. I know there are a lot of issues associated with that, so I'm afraid I can't answer that right now.
Еще вопросы, пожалуйста.
Здравствуйте, спасибо за лекцию. Я хотел задать такой вопрос. В России довольно низкая технологичность у производственных компаний. Как бороться с страхом технологии вот у низшего, скажем так, состава? Спасибо.
Okay, well, I think it's absolutely imperative that a company that wants to maintain its stature and position within the industry needs to change. Everyone needs to be looking at modernization and transformation, transforming their companies with as much technology as can be done. Throughout all of the majors in the West now, we have a huge investment that we're making in big data, and we're hiring as many data scientists as engineers now to try and use as much of the information that we have from our fields to increase the technology, to make the fields more efficient, more productive, and safer. And we're doing that because we need to do that to be able to stay in the business. And I would think that any company that is operating within a commercial framework is going to see that they have to do that. So I think the market will eventually push them to that, particularly as they see the benefits that companies around them are having as they start to introduce those technologies. I mean, I don't know the specific companies you're addressing there, but the ones that I have been involved with, through my work with Rosneft and through people I know at Gazprom and Novatek, I do think they're looking very much towards technological improvements, and I'm sure many, many other companies are doing that as well here.
Спасибо. Пожалуйста.
Within the UN Sustainable Development Goals, there is an important component, clean energy. What is your view on the question if natural gas is a clean energy source or not? Thank you.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Is natural gas a clean energy source?
Oh, absolutely. Well, it's all relative, of course. Compared to oil, compared to coal, yeah, natural gas, I would say, is a clean energy source. I think it's very important that it could be viewed as a swing source in the future to provide kind of consistent baseline of energy. And at the UN, we view there isn't one solution right now. We need to look at sort of a a complete portfolio of solutions that need to go into solving this issue. And I think natural gas plays a big component in that, absolutely. Within the, for myself, I live in the United Kingdom, and we consider the interconnect that brings gas to the UK as part of our clean energy source. So yeah, I think it is generally viewed that way.
Еще вопросы, пожалуйста. Пожалуйста.
Yes, I have a question regarding the E3 group on the economical axis. According to you, it includes two groups of resources. One is not fully prospected, and another already prospected but with very low expected economic viability. Why is it one group that combines these two distinct categories instead of why don't you have an E3 group and an E4 for these two?
Yeah. I think it was done that way for mapping purposes to the PRMS and Crisco systems, where those two types of projects are lumped together there. Now, I didn't go into the detail here, but if you go into this website and download the UNFC documents that go through and explain it in more detail, we actually have a whole nother level of subcategories beyond what I showed there. So there is an E3.1, an E3.2, and even an E3.3 that goes through and subdivides that. And the E3.1 and the E3.2 subdivide them just the way you suggested there. So we do recognize that you need that additional granularity to describe those two projects, those two different types of projects. And I think it's very important that that is done, just as you say, because how you address those two projects is completely different. You know, one, if you haven't done enough appraisal yet to make that decision, means that you're going to have to go out and gather more data or do more processing of your existing data. Whereas the other type of project that's not commercial means you need to look at the finances about that project. What do you need to do to make that more an efficient project, one that makes more money? And this is the use of the UNFC, as I mentioned. The real value of it is identifying the barriers to progression rather than which of the categories you place it in. So it's a very good, very insightful question. Thank you.
Thank you for the answer.
Спасибо. Еще вопросы? Пожалуйста.
David, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. So today you were talking also about the renewable energy, the renewables. So my first question, what do you think in the BP portfolio, how much the company is paying attention on the renewables? And my second question, what do you think about Russia and the plans about the renewables in Russia, because you know that we are mostly focused on oil and gas development?
Okay, great. So BP is very much interested in pushing forward our alternative energies portfolios, both through wind and through our biofuels development there. And we're always looking for other new and innovative ways to do this. There is a real problem right now in that it's actually difficult to define where you should be making a big investment. If BP made a number of very big investments into renewables, I guess it was 20 years ago now, we were very big into solar power, and frankly, we lost a lot of money. We were a bit too early. We were too early in the industry to do that. And so while we're fully committed to aiding the development of a renewable arm to BP, this alternative energy arms, we are going in cautiously to make sure that we're making the right decisions. And one of the ways we're doing this is by, rather than making one big gamble, we're making lots and lots of small steps in this. So we're investing in many, many different companies. So on our downstream end, we're investing in companies that develop fast charging, because really the electric cars aren't going to become mainstream unless you can charge them quickly, you know, so that you don't have what we call range anxiety in English, that you know, how far you're going to be able to go before you need to recharge, and then how long it takes to recharge. You know, right now, a Tesla takes an hour to recharge. You know, and there are very few charging points. So it's very hard to make that a practical solution for everyone. So that's one thing we're investing in, is how to do faster charging. We're investing in, one interesting one is we're also looking not just at alternative energies, but ways to reduce carbon in general. And one thing we're doing, one of the larger emitters of carbon and CO2 in the world is actually the construction of concrete. So making concrete and cement is a huge producer of CO2. We have strategic relationships with a company that is able to reduce that amount of CO2 emissions by many, many factors. And so we're looking at ways to do that. So BP is looking at long-term, as we believe that carbon pricing is really the thing that's necessary, is that companies are effectively charged for the amount of carbon they produce, and they're able to trade those credits effectively as they save. That is the way we're looking forward excuse me, to incentivizing reduced carbon across the industry. I really I can't answer your second question there about Russia, unfortunately. I don't know. I'm sure BP would be interested in some sort of strategic investments here at some point in time, but I'm not really sure what the status of that is right now. So thank you.
Спасибо. Еще вопросы? Так, пожалуйста. Так. Давайте вот там, потом вы.
Да, спасибо за интересный доклад. British Petroleum работает в различных климатических зонах, в различных природных зонах. И скажите, есть ли какая-то принципиальная разница в стоимости добываемой баррель нефти в разных климатических условиях? И второй вопрос, не был затронут, наверное, в тему не сильно входил. Какие-то есть принципиальные различия в сохранении окружающей природы при добыче нефти в разных условиях климатических?
Well, there's certainly cost implications based on the environment in which we're working. Whether we're going from BP has a very broad range, so we produce oil and gas from north of the Arctic Circle, and we have for many, many years since the discovery of Prudhoe Bay back in 1969, I think it was. And from there all the way through to developments in the deserts in North Africa. So we do deal with all climates and in between there. And certainly there are implications and requirements in the construction of the different types of facilities for those. So yeah, obviously there are going to be cost implications for that. In terms of what's needed to be done for the environment, again, yeah, absolutely. There's differences there in a location that has two offshore locations comparing, say, the area west of the Shetland Islands in the United Kingdom, where seas are extremely volatile, and you can have Force 9 and Force 10 winds are very regular and very huge sea conditions. A lot goes into thinking about how you would be able to manage and protect against any spills in that location. And that's different from how you would address the same problem, equally as important, but different sorts of issues if you're in, say, the west coast of Angola, where the seas are much more benign, and you have a different type of development there with FPSOs and floating facilities. So yes, absolutely, there's differences.
Спасибо большое. Вы знаете, к сожалению, все, время заканчивается у нас. Подпирает другая аудитория уже с другой лекцией. I want to say thank you very much for David for your lecture, and I think that everybody is satisfied. Everybody is receive a good answer for your questions. One more say thank you for David together, and we would like to see him again in this auditorium. Thank you. Спасибо. Great. Good? Very good. Thank you very much. Okay.
Я зайду, я должен пару слов, но потом ретируюсь, чтобы не уводить. Вот это тоже, наверное, важно.
Да, все микрофоны сюда возвращаем.